Hey everyone, Erickson Drone here. This is Jesse. Today I'm in Petaluma, just west of the town of Sonoma in Northern California, at General Vallejo's Petaluma Adobe home.
On this hill overlooking Petaluma Valley, General Mariano Vallejo selected a site for his rancho on the Adobe Creek, which gave him an excellent source of water in a Mediterranean climate with rich soil. Construction on the building began in 1836, which was made of adobe and hand-split redwood planks. Walls were plastered and whitewashed, and there was a huge second-story veranda that covered the adobe walls from the elements. But General Vallejo wouldn't even get to see the completion of the complex. He was later taken prisoner in his own home in Sonoma during the Bear Flag Revolt. But he wasn't here just to build a home and start a garden. And that story really begins with the missions of California. The first mission was established in 1776, and the last was right in Sonoma, San Francisco de Solano, in 1823. Villages were emptied as the native people were brought in to the missions as laborers and craftspeople. But when the Mexican government separated from Spain, they began to secularize the missions into parish churches. The holdings were sold off as land grants, and in 1834, Governor Jose Figueroa ordered Lieutenant Vallejo, commandant of the San Francisco Presidio at the time, to secularize the mission and start a pueblo in Sonoma, north of San Francisco Bay. This is at the time where the Russians had made it to the coast of Sonoma, which is why there are so many things named after Russians in Sonoma, like Fort Ross or the Russian River. So Mexico wanted to increase its presence to kind of tame that threat that was posed by the Russians. So Vallejo was promoted to Commandant General, and they gave him 44,000 acres of land, with another 22,000 acres of land later, which he named Rancho de Petaluma. This is 100 square miles of land, but it also came at a cost. See, Vallejo would have to rely on all of his goods and crops produced at the rancho to help support his military command because he was not going to be supported with anything adequate from the Mexican government. So that's why hide and tallow became the rancho's main form of income. Parking at admission to the Adobe is just $3, and there's a bunch of picnic spots outside too. And if you save your receipt, you can actually go over to the Mission and Vallejo's Sonoma home, which is just about a 10-minute car drive, which would have been probably about 2 hours by carriage. The museum has a lot of exhibits, and they explain to you about the hide and tallow trade and the natives that were here and the evolution through Spanish colonization and into the Mexican government, and acknowledging that at this time, the Indians were the cowboys. Here's a big old set of horns here. Nice. This painted glass window's amazing. And we're going to head into our first room over here. This is going to be the weaving room or the pantry. Typical of the time, the women that were working at the adobe were responsible for cooking and the domestic chores. And at one point, there was over 3,000 sheep on the ranch. So their wool was used for clothing, blankets, and even carpeting. This was painstaking work that took a long time, so most people only owned a few outfits. And you can see here on the shelves drop spindles, which were used before the spinning wheel even arrived in Northern California. This is the courtyard. Imagine what this place would have been like almost 200 years ago. You have these beautiful Spanish beehive ovens, cast iron pots clanging around, and candle making, tallow rendering, drying wool, all within this area and in all the rooms that are just adjacent to this courtyard. The rancho here was supposed to form a complete rectangle and enclose the courtyard, but it never got completed, and so part of the foundation is here roped off by the trees. I thought this was a cemetery plot at first, and even on iPhone maps it does say Vallejo Family Cemetery, but there's no markers or anything at all. All right, so this room had multiple purposes. It was a workroom and a granary. Carpenters and blacksmiths also had their workrooms in this area, and final touches would be done on tools, clothing, and building materials. There was a huge production of grain at the rancho, and so you needed somewhere to store the grain and something to store it in. The grains they were harvesting were corn, barley, and wheat. Over here, you find this large stone wheel with a wooden handle, and this was their grist mill, or piedra de amolar. It was used to grind the grain. So you would hold the wooden handle and move around, or more likely, an animal would be moving around in a constant circular motion, and that would grind the grain. We're going to make our way into another important room here. This is the hide storeroom and leather working room. And never underestimate the value of a good belt. Remember, the main economic driver of the ranch was based on the hide and tallow trade. Tallow is the fat of cattle, and you can use it to make soap, candles, and even explosives. Hide and tallow were traded to Europeans and Americans and other foreign merchants in exchange for their manufactured goods. The problem was that there really wasn't any way to keep the meat fresh from all these cattle that had been slaughtered for their hides, so a lot of carcasses were just left in the fields to rot. This wall of hides really represents, well, how many animals they had to go through. Do you know what adobe is actually made of? When the building began, they used tree nails and rawhide lashings to hold the beams together, and then eventually moved to iron nails, hinges, glass windows. But adobe is actually made of clay, sand, dirt, straw, water, and manure. And about 80% of the adobe bricks here today are original. My wife's chili verde is my favorite food, and I would love to have a fiesta out here. Also, we're right next to the airport, and it was challenging to get drone shots here. You can see on this map that these are the uncontrolled airports that are in Sonoma, and we are essentially right next to it at this little intersection here. So we've had to be careful. My coworker said that she did an overnight here one time, and I did confirm that with the ranger that was here. And she said that when they used to run, the rangers would make them carry logs from one place to another. And I asked the rangers about that. They said, yeah, if they're running, they might as well be doing something productive. So, no running. We're making our way to the first quarters now, and the quarters upstairs of the adobe were generally reserved for those that had a higher status. And here is the married servants' quarters. Theirs was a little more luxury. They had carpets and they had these curtains here that were used for separation. You'll see when we get to the single servants' quarters that this is by and far essentially luxury. And here's our first view from the second story veranda. With a little shed of some sort that we might be able to explore later. Welcome to the single servants' quarters. Look a little bit different than the married servants' quarters. Yeah, they don't have raised beds here. They slept on straw mats, and I guess that was some comfort from the hard floor, but there were very little windows and doors. So, I mean, the light that's coming through right now, this is almost midday, but it was dark and hard. And here's just a jolly old poem about a happy flea. Now, you might be thinking life was pretty bleak, but a tough life isn't a pointless life. And sometimes they would roll up the bed mats, bring in some food, and play some music and dance. This was the fandango room, or at least the fandango part of the room. See these instruments in the corner over here? That was the kind of entertainment that really made you forget about the workday. And here's just a really good shot of the inside of the adobe and how thick it really was. This part is still plastered with the whitewash there, but these were thick, thick walls. Notice anything different about this room? The size, for one. It's much bigger than the servants' quarters, and it has furnishings and a seating area. The ceiling would have been covered with cloth, although it's not in this display. This was the mayor domo's room, or the adobe supervisor. Although it translates to butler in Spanish, this position was much more. While Vallejo was busy commanding the entire northern frontier, the mayordomo was in charge of all the trade that happened through the adobe, including supervising the workforce. These next areas were actually used and lived in by the general and his family, so they're much more grand. Vallejo is known as an intellectual and often read by this fireplace. The walls and ceiling are painted with different colors, mirrors would reflect candlelight, and they ate off china. The family's bedroom is now closed off, but you can see it through the opening there. On the walls are more mirrors and artwork, which signified their social standing, like clothing at the time. Vallejo spent most of his time in Sonoma and didn't really get to come out to the rancho as much as he would have liked. In fact, the adobe wasn't even complete by the time he was taken prisoner, first in his own home and then later at Sutter's Fort during the Bear Flag Revolt, and that was in 1846. They kept him for months, and by the time he got out, squatters had already taken over multiple parts of his land. He tried to lease it and make a profit, but in just about 10 years, he ended up selling the property. The property was once considered for the site of a University of California, but that fell through. And then the native sons of the Golden West bought the adobe in 1910 and kept it alive until the state bought it in 1951. Today, the state still owns a small portion of what was once the largest privately owned adobe building in California. It became a state historic landmark in 1932, just number 18, and in 1970 became a national historic landmark. Thanks so much for taking a walk with me. Like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one.
Vou te contar bem direitinho de fandango na fronteira. Paneirão se dança xote, também se dança rancheira. Os gaúchos são